What if the most famous prayer in the world, the Lord's Prayer, was never a plea for salvation at all, but an encoded escape map hidden in plain sight? What if every line you were taught to repeat in faith was actually a Gnostic warning about the archons, the soul prison, and the false god ruling this material matrix? And what if the words you trusted most were edited so carefully that the code remained, but the exit was sealed? Welcome to the Decode. Tonight, we are opening the lost ending of the Lord's Prayer, the Gnostic secret the Church suppressed to conceal the Demiurge. This isn't a theory, it's a rescue. For millennia, humanity has recited these words in unison. Millions of people every day asking for bread, asking for forgiveness, asking for deliverance from evil, believing they were reaching toward heaven while never realizing who was listening. But look around. The prison has never been more sophisticated. The debt has never been deeper. Evil has never been so normalized. Control is everywhere, and it wears the face of order, morality, and faith. Why? Because the prayer is incomplete. Because the institution that claimed to guard the truth chose instead to suppress gnosis, direct knowing, and cut off the most important part. They left you with the plea, but removed the activation. They preserved the ritual, but severed the power. They taught generations to kneel, to ask, to obey, while hiding the line that could have turned prayer into code, faith into escape, and submission into remembrance. What you are about to hear is not entertainment, not speculation, and not theology as usual. It is the first crack in the wall, and once you see it, you will never hear this prayer the same way again. The most dangerous prison is the one that can make you believe you are already free. And perhaps the deepest spell ever cast over the human soul is not a chain of iron, but a sacred language repeated so often that no one thinks to ask what was removed from it, what was softened, what was hidden behind reverence and habit. What if that is the real story beneath the prayer so many lips have spoken for centuries? Some people carry a quiet sense that something essential was cut away long before they arrived, that the words they inherited still shimmer with power but no longer open what they were meant to open. In the Gnostic imagination, that missing piece is the activation, the turn from plea to declaration, from dependence to remembrance, from kneeling before an outer authority to awakening the spark within. Once that possibility appears, the entire prayer begins to tremble. The texts discovered at Nag Hammadi, including works such as the Apocryphon of John, preserve a vision of reality very different from the one most people were taught. In that vision, there is the pleroma, the fullness, the immeasurable source, beyond images, beyond names, beyond the reach of the ordinary mind, a living sea of light from which the deepest essence of the soul descends. And then there is the lesser maker, the Demiurge, sometimes named Yaldabaoth, a blind and jealous ruler who fashions the material order in ignorance and then mistakes his own limited power for the whole of divinity. He says, in effect, that there is no God but himself, and that one claim becomes the architecture of a world built on forgetting. When the Gnostics heard the opening words, "Our Father who art in heaven," they did not hear comfort first. They heard a question: which Father? Which heaven? The familiar image offered by tradition is simple and reassuring. A distant king above the clouds, watching, judging, governing from on high. But the Gnostic ear heard something more unsettling. What if the heaven being addressed is not the boundless light of the pleroma, but the enclosed heaven of the system itself, the firmament, the upper limit of the constructed world, the luminous ceiling of the prison? What if the prayer, as commonly received, trains the soul to keep looking upward and outward, away from the buried ember of knowing inside itself? In that reading, the first trap is not obvious evil. It is misdirection. It is the suggestion that salvation comes from beyond you, from the same structure that taught you to distrust your own inner sight. And this is why the language of the old Gnostics still feels strangely modern. The prison is not merely a mythic place, it is a pattern. It appears anywhere consciousness is trained to seek validation before intuition. It lives in systems that study your hunger and feed it back to you in polished forms. It lives in the endless demand to perform, to compare, to submit to whatever stares back from the glowing screen and tells you who you are supposed to be. The archons, in this symbolic sense, are not only cosmic rulers from forgotten texts. They are every mechanism that keeps awareness fragmented, fascinated, and externally directed. The digital world can become a counterfeit heaven, brilliant and seductive, offering connection while draining presence, surrounding the mind with noise until the person forgets the still point inside from which real perception begins. And perhaps that is why this old language returns now with such force. It does not return to win an argument. It returns because many people already feel, in their nerves and in their exhaustion, that something in the world has been designed to keep them looking away from themselves. So pause for a moment and notice the weight of your body, the pull of gravity, the ordinary fact of being here. Feel the pressure of this world, the density of it, the way it claims your attention through obligation, fear, and repetition. And then ask a quieter question. What is it that notices all of this? What is the awareness behind the eyes that watches sensation come and go? In the Gnostic way of seeing, that witness is not the prison. It is the trace of what came before the prison, the spark that still remembers even when the mind does not. It is subtle, but once felt, it changes the tone of the prayer completely. The words no longer move only upward. They begin to turn inward. The search no longer starts in heaven as a faraway destination. It begins in the hidden chamber of consciousness itself. And that changes everything, because once the first line has been questioned, the next lines can no longer remain innocent, and the prayer that once sounded like dependence begins to reveal a second voice beneath it, one that speaks not of moral failure alone, but of hunger, amnesia, debt, and the possibility of remembering what was never truly lost. And once the first line begins to open inward instead of upward, the next movement of the prayer starts to feel less like a request for survival and more like a coded description of the soul's condition inside the world. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. On the surface, these are gentle words: bread, forgiveness, moral balance, the kind of language people can repeat for a lifetime without disturbance. But in the Gnostic atmosphere, the meaning shifts. Bread is no longer only bread. Debt is no longer only sin. And the prayer begins to speak in a hidden register, one that touches the deepest fatigue many people carry without knowing how to name it. In the usual reading, daily bread means sustenance for the body, enough to continue another day in the world. There is nothing false in that. The body does need food. But the Gnostics were listening for another hunger beneath the visible one. The greater starvation, to them, was not physical. It was spiritual amnesia. It was the slow forgetting of origin, the dimming of the inner memory that tells a person they are more than the identities, fears, and roles they have been handed. In that sense, the true daily bread is gnosis, not as academic knowledge, not as information to collect, but as living recognition, a daily nourishment of remembrance, a flash of direct knowing that restores the connection between the soul and its source. The body asks for bread so it can continue. The soul asks for gnosis so it can awaken. And once you feel that distinction, the line changes color. It no longer sounds like begging the system to keep the machine running. It begins to sound like a quiet cry for the one thing the system cannot truly give and cannot forever suppress: inner recognition. This is where the idea of debt becomes even more revealing. For many centuries, religious institutions built vast emotional worlds around guilt, sin, confession, penance, and absolution. Debt became moralized, a burden of wrongdoing recorded somewhere above, a ledger in which the soul is always behind and always in need of mediation. It is a powerful structure because it keeps a person turned toward an external authority, hoping the burden will finally be lifted by permission. But the Gnostic imagination bends that line in a different direction. The original debt is not simply moral offense. It is forgetting. It is ignorance in the deepest sense, not stupidity, but estrangement from one's own inner nature. Our debt is that we have forgotten what we are. We have invested our belief in the world of surfaces as if it were the whole of reality. We have treated the temporary as ultimate, the mask as the face, the prison as the home. And from that forgetting, all the rest unfolds. In this symbolic framework, what later traditions call sin can be understood less as a list of forbidden acts and more as participation in illusion, living as though the visible order is all there is, and attaching oneself to fear, status, shame, resentment, and the frantic effort to secure permanence in a world built on change. That attachment generates weight. It creates entanglement. The old Gnostic language might describe these as bonds, cords, or chains, subtle ties that keep the soul revolving inside the machinery of forgetfulness. So when the prayer says, "Forgive us our debts," the meaning becomes more intimate, more interior, and in some ways, more unsettling. It is no longer merely a plea for pardon. It becomes a longing for dissolution, a release from the trance itself. Let the ignorance fall away. Let the false identifications loosen. Let the inner knot begin to untie. And when it continues, as we forgive our debtors, this too changes shape. It is not just an instruction in moral politeness. It becomes an invitation to release the karmic hooks that bind one wounded self to another, to see that so many harms in this world arise between people who are themselves trapped in the same forgetting, acting from fear, role, conditioning, and inherited blindness. Forgiveness, in this symbolic sense, is not denial. It is de-entanglement. It is the refusal to keep feeding the chain. And this is where the ancient language meets modern life with uncomfortable precision. We live in a civilization organized around debt. People are born into systems of obligation they never consented to, trained to measure worth through productivity, income, ownership, and endless striving. The chase for material bread never ends. Bills become identity. Scarcity becomes atmosphere. Stress becomes normal. Anxiety becomes background sound. Entire lives can pass in the effort to keep up with demands that were designed to multiply faster than the soul can breathe. In that light, debt is not just an economic condition. It is a spiritual climate, keeping people busy, worried, and externally focused. It narrows attention, feeds helplessness, and makes remembrance feel impractical. That is why the symbol is so powerful. The outer system mirrors the inner one. The financial order becomes a visible image of a deeper captivity, a world in which one is always told there is more to owe, more to fix, more to prove, more to pay before one can rest. But perhaps the most radical possibility hidden in this line is that the deepest cancellation does not come from outside. It begins when a person sees through the spell. Think for a moment about whatever debt lives closest to your chest. Money, guilt, obligation, regret. The old story that says you are still bound to something you can never fully repay. Feel how heavy it becomes when it hardens into identity. And then imagine, if only for a breath, that this burden is not the center of what you are. Imagine a light beneath it, something earlier than the shame, steadier than the fear, untouched by the economy of punishment. In the Gnostic mood, That is the spark beginning to remember itself. It does not shatter the chain by force. It sees beyond it. And in that seeing, the chain is revealed for what it is: a structure sustained by belief, repetition, and emotional investment. And in that seeing, something begins to soften. The prayer, then, is no longer asking the jailer for comfort. It is becoming a method of inner release. Daily bread becomes remembrance. Debt becomes amnesia. Forgiveness becomes disentanglement. And when those meanings start to awaken, the prayer moves toward its most dangerous threshold, because the next line will ask not merely for relief, but for freedom from the hypnosis of the world itself. And when the prayer reaches that threshold, it stops sounding like a soft religious closing and begins to reveal the sharp edge that may have always been hidden inside it. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the familiar reading, these are words of protection, a plea not to fall into moral failure and not to be overtaken by some force of darkness outside oneself. But within the Gnostic atmosphere, temptation takes on a different gravity. It is not merely indulgence. It is not simply appetite. It is not reduced to the obvious dramas of excess. The deepest temptation is to forget again. It is to become so absorbed in the material order, so hypnotized by the visible world, so entangled in fear, identity, competition, and distraction that the soul begins to mistake the prison for reality itself. Temptation, in this symbolic reading, is the pull of simulation. It is the seduction of surfaces. It is the subtle invitation to live as though the screen is more real than awareness, as though noise is more real than silence, as though the frantic movement of the outer world is more trustworthy than the quiet intelligence within. To say, "Lead us not into temptation," then, is no longer a timid request to be spared from ordinary weakness. It becomes a cry of lucidity. Do not let me fall fully asleep inside the illusion. Do not let me hand my sight over to the machinery of distraction. Do not let me forget what I am while moving through what I am not. And then comes the phrase, "Deliver us from evil," which in many traditions has been heard in broad moral terms. Evil as darkness, evil as corruption, evil as the general presence of suffering or malice in the world. But the older symbolic possibility is more intimate and more precise. In the Greek tradition, the phrase can carry the sense not only of evil in the abstract, but of the evil one, the hostile ruler, the false authority, the principle of distortion itself. Within the Gnostic lens, this opens the line completely. The prayer is no longer asking for protection from vague negativity. It is asking for separation from the architect of confusion, from the pattern that keeps consciousness bound to fear, division, and forgetfulness. Deliver me from the chief illusion. Remove me from the spell of the lower order. Untangle my awareness from the system that feeds on fragmentation. At that point, the prayer is not ending at all. It is turning. And this is where the final word becomes almost unbearably important. Amen, in conventional habit, often lands like a period, a respectful closing, a sign that the prayer is complete. But across mystical and esoteric traditions, the sacred utterance at the end of a formula can function as more than conclusion. It can be a seal, a frequency, a fastening of intention, a way of fixing inner alignment into place. In that sense, Amen is not merely "so be it" in the passive voice of hope. It can be felt as a quiet act of authority. I seal this. I recognize this. I stand in it. The prayer no longer trails off into uncertainty. It closes the circuit. And here, the forbidden possibility begins to emerge more clearly, because early Christian tradition was not entirely uniform on how the prayer ended. The Didache, one of the earliest Christian writings outside the New Testament canon, preserves a doxological ending in a form associated with early worship. And later manuscript traditions also carry concluding lines that are absent from the shorter Roman usage. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. That ending eventually became familiar in many Christian communities, yet the symbolic tension around it never fully disappeared. For a Gnostic ear, the danger was never just in whether the line existed, but in who the thine was assumed to be. If the prayer directs the soul outward toward the false father, then the doxology reinforces submission. But if the prayer has already turned inward toward the hidden spark and beyond that toward the true source, then the same line becomes something else entirely. It becomes activation. It becomes inversion. It becomes the moment the prayer stops functioning as dependence and begins functioning as remembrance. For thine is the kingdom, can then be heard not as flattery offered to a distant ruler, but as recognition that the kingdom of Gnosis belongs to the divine spark awakening within. The power is no longer monopolized by institution, hierarchy, or cosmic gatekeeper. It is the sovereignty of consciousness that no false order can permanently erase. The glory is not worldly shine. It is the memory of the pleroma, the radiance of origin, the beauty of what the soul was before fear taught it to shrink. In this symbolic reading, the lost ending is not a decorative flourish. It is the missing reversal. It returns authority to the place from which it was displaced. And that possibility explains why this prayer still reaches so deeply into modern life. The old temptation has not vanished. It has become ambient. It appears in the infinite scroll, in the economy of outrage, in the systems that keep attention captured and identity reactive. Every hour spent mesmerized by comparison, fear, envy, status, performance, and manufactured urgency strengthens the same ancient pattern. The world becomes louder, faster, more crowded with signals, and the person begins to live outwardly by reflex, as though there were no chamber within untouched by all of it. That is why the final movement of the prayer can be lived, not merely recited. Open your hands for a moment, even in imagination. Feel the air on your skin. Notice something simple and immediate, the fact of presence before interpretation rushes in. What carries experience to you is not the same as experience itself. Your thoughts can narrate reality, but they are not the seer. The awareness beneath breath, sensation, sound, and silence is nearer to the center than any role you have learned to perform. In that recognition, Amen becomes a declaration of inner sovereignty, not a boast, not a rejection of mystery, a quiet consent to the deepest thing you can still feel beneath the noise. The entire prayer, seen this way, becomes a kind of soul technology, not in the cold mechanical sense, but as a sequence of reorientation. First, the opening line asks you to question what you have been taught to worship and to sense the hidden spark beneath the inherited image. Then the bread and the dead reveal that your deepest hunger is remembrance and your deepest burden is forgetting. Then temptation is unmasked as distraction, evil as the system of distortion, and Amen as the seal that gathers scattered awareness back into itself. Finally, the restored ending completes the motion. The kingdom, the power, and the glory are no longer kept at an unreachable distance. They become intimate again, not possessed by the ego, not weaponized against others, but recognized as the birthright of the soul's connection to the true source. And perhaps that is the real reversal hidden in the prayer all along. Not a command to deny the world, but an invitation to see through its claims. Not a promise that someone else will rescue you while you remain asleep, but a whispered reminder that what you call rescue may begin as remembrance. The old words remain, but their center of gravity changes. They no longer ask you to remain small before the veil. They ask you to notice the light by which the veil is seen. And once that light is noticed, even faintly, the prayer is never only a prayer again. It becomes a mirror, a threshold, and a quiet interior uprising that no outer power can do on your behalf, and no outer power can entirely take away. What moved through this space was not meant to force an answer, only to let an older pattern become visible in a quieter way. If something in these words felt strangely familiar, if a line opened inside you, if a memory without images seemed to stir for a moment, not every recognition arrives as certainty. Some arrive as stillness. Some arrive as a soft shift in the way the world is felt, and sometimes that is enough. The prayer we walk through may now sound different in your inner ear, not because anything new was added, but because something gentle may have been returned to its place. The symbols, the tension, the hidden meanings, the questions about heaven, bread, debt, temptation, and the final seal have already done their work simply by being seen. There is nothing here that asks for strain now, nothing that needs to be chased. If part of you feels tender, unsettled, relieved, or quietly awake, that too belongs. These responses are not random. They are part of the shape of the path you are already on. You are not late to it. You are not outside of it. You have not been forgotten by it. Whatever has been ripening in silence within you may simply have found the language it needed for this moment. And if some things still feel unfinished, they can remain unfinished a little longer. Not everything hidden needs to be opened all at once. Some truths draw nearer the way dawn does, gradually, without force, until what once seemed distant is simply there. So let this settle where it settles. Let the echoes fall into place in their own time. The thread has not been lost. It has only become visible again. And from here, the next step is not a demand, but a continuation, because there are other buried symbols, other hidden patterns, and other forgotten layers waiting just beyond this one. To me, what makes this kind of reflection so powerful is not whether every symbol must be taken literally, but the way it can suddenly make an old prayer feel alive again, as if something familiar has been quietly waiting beneath the surface all along. Sometimes, a text does not come back into our lives to give us answers. Sometimes it returns like a mirror, showing us how tired we have been, how long we have searched outside ourselves, and how deeply we may have wanted a door where we were only told to see a wall. That is the feeling this journey leaves with me. Not fear, not certainty, more like a strange stillness, as if an ancient room inside the soul has been opened for a moment and the air in that room feels different. And maybe that is why this matters. Because for some people, this will sound like symbolism. For others, it may feel like memory. For others still, it may awaken questions they did not expect to carry tonight. So I'm genuinely curious what this stirred in you. Did this perspective change the way you hear the Lord's Prayer? Did any part of it feel familiar, unsettling, comforting, or deeply personal in a way you can't fully explain yet? If you feel like sharing, leave your thoughts in the comments and let your voice become part of this wider conversation. Even a single sentence can say a lot. You could simply write, "I hear it differently now," or "Something in me remembered." And if this reflection resonated with you, if it opened even the smallest space inside you, you can leave a thought below, stay close, and return for the next layer when it finds you. There are more symbols to uncover, more forgotten meanings to sit with, and perhaps more of your own story waiting in them than you realize.